Welcome everybody. I'm Anirin Bosley, assistant professor in the School of Journalism and Communication here at Carleton University. Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that Carleton's campus is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. I'm very pleased to be moderating this panel on journalism ethics. The COVID-19 pandemic has served as a poignant reminder that people in the world are increasingly connected. The coronavirus has spread to virtually all corners of the world, becoming a primary concern for billions of people from countless different cultures. At the same time, the pandemic has raised many questions related to ethics, such as how we think about a more global conception of ethics, how we cover more marginalized communities that also happen to be disproportionately affected by the pandemic, or how we think about things like health data at a time when our collective health is more interrelated than it's been in generations. It goes without saying that ethics is a large and complex area, but I think this panel will give us all some new and important ways to think about it. So let me introduce the panelists. Dr. Anita Varma is the Assistant Director for Journalism and Media Ethics, as well as social sector ethics at Santa Clara University in California, and a lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley. Varma was also an online advertising strategist at Google, which is a very interesting addition. Dr. Stephen J. Ward is Professor Emeritus and Distinguished Lecturer on Ethics at the University of British Columbia. He's written and edited 10 books on media ethics, including the award-winning Radical Media Ethics and the Innovation of Journalism Ethics. And Pat Perkle is the Executive Director of the National News Media Council, former editor of Your Commonwealth, and a member of the Ethics Advisory Committee at the Canadian Association of Journalists. Welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to make just two quick points about process. So first, on the Socio platform, for all of our all the people who are joining us, you have a chat feature, so please feel free to ask questions as they arise. And once we get into the discussion segment, I'll moderate, with the help of Jenna, I'll moderate those questions and present them in as orderly a way as I can. Second, Anita is unfortunately not able to stay with us until the end of this session. So after her presentation, we'll pause for a few minutes so that she can answer any questions you might have. After that, we'll continue with presentations from Stephen and Pat, and then take more general questions at that point. So with all that, I will hand the floor, virtually speaking, to Anita Varma.
Thank you so much, and many thanks to all the organizers. I know there's been a tremendous amount of work put into bringing together all of us for journalism in the time of crisis. As Anirin mentioned, I am at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics, which is at Santa Clara University in the Bay Area of California, which you may have seen in the news for a variety of reasons, not the least of which have been wildfires as well as rising COVID cases. Honestly, since the beginning of the pandemic, it's been difficult to find a reprieve. So my focus in journalism ethics is on how we can help journalists do what they're trying to do better. And I've never met a journalist who says what I'd really like to do is exhaust audiences, to desensitize them to really pressing issues. If you know of a reporter who says that is their goal, please let me know. But mostly what I hear from the journalists who I work with is that they're trying to help. They're trying to do work that will help improve the biggest issues that affect all of us. And at this moment, COVID rises to the top of that list in many regions. So the major ethical consideration that I see coming up all the time and yet not really being addressed head on in the pandemic is this issue of desensitization. And the remedy that I want to suggest and that I offer to journalists who I work with at the Markkula Center is something called solidarity reporting, where we would focus on communities and what those communities' needs are in their own words. But let me take a couple of steps back before we get there to start by explaining what I mean by desensitization. So back in April at, what feels like a very long time ago, I wrote a piece for the Markkula Center's blog, and it was called What to Do When the Numbers in the News Become Benumbing. And as most of you, if not all of you, have probably experienced, reading a lot of numbers heavy accounts can start to desensitize us to what's going on, even when what's happening has a very real and immediate threat to each of us. It's not necessarily that very far away there's something bad happening. And yet the impact of numbers is somewhat unsurprising, given that this is consistent across different types of coverage we've seen in the past. In the US, we're seeing numbers about COVID cases, numbers about COVID deaths. We also see tons of numbers about unemployment. We see numbers about who is going to win the presidential election, how many votes have been cast. And it's a barrage of numbers that, from many journalists' perspectives, are meant to offer an ethical representation of a large and complicated population. And yet the impact on audiences can be to overwhelm them and ultimately lead to them turning away from issues that really do matter to them. So, looking into the social psychology literature on fatigue, all of this starts to become a little less mysterious. So, when people feel overwhelmed, when they feel over aroused, when they feel that there's tons of bad stuff happening and I need to pay attention to all of it, there's pretty consistently three things that will happen. Number one, people will grow distressed. If you know someone who is not at all distressed right now, I would like to meet them too. So, number one, we get to distress. Number two, people start to try to emotionally regulate, and that often means blaming the victim, to say that, well, the people who are contracting COVID, people who are still suffering, they probably did something to bring it upon themselves. They probably took an unnecessary risk. Maybe they didn't really take it seriously about what their comorbidities were. It could happen to them, but certainly it's not a widespread issue. That is some of the mental gymnastics that people start to engage in to try to emotionally regulate down from this heightened fear state that no one can sustain. The third piece of this process is that people will go numb and they'll turn away. And that is unfortunately exactly what we're seeing right now in many parts of the US, where people are expressing pandemic fatigue. They're tired of it. They're tired of reading about the pandemic. They're tired of learning about the pandemic. They're tired of the precautions. They're simply tired of it. And so as a result, news coverage that is focused on the numbers, on the scale of threat, and on the continued lack of resolution among our leaders about how to address this, audiences will turn away from that as well, which is really concerning as we enter a cold and flu season, which is expected to bring back even more of this virus load and cases of it. So I'll say two things on that before moving into our remedy, which is that unfortunately, this is unsurprising. We see this in coverage of wars, coverage of homelessness, coverage of natural disasters, where the appeal to numbers and statistics, I believe that for many journalists, it's coming from a good place of trying to convey magnitude. And yet numbers alone lead to a numbing process that is entirely something we can anticipate and that we're already seeing happen yet again. So that's where the ethical issue arises. If news coverage is attempting to offer a public service right now, these existing techniques may not be what are best suited for achieving that goal. So let me wrap up my remarks by offering what I view as a really important and valuable possibility for a path forward that in some community news outlets is already taking hold, which is called a solidarity approach. So first and foremost, a solidarity approach to reporting is not about putting a happy spin on a global pandemic. I would doubt that there's one that we would find as a legitimate priority right now. But what it is about is locating hope in paths forward articulated by the communities most adversely affected by the status quo. So we hear this day in and day out that coronavirus has disproportionately affected Black and Brown communities in poverty. And yet I find a very small number of stories that actually speak to Black and Brown communities in poverty other than obituaries, right? And obituaries are a genre of reporting. Those of you who have taken or teach intro to journalism, that's one of the mainstays, but it's insufficient for understanding what this community spread looks like, why current precautions are not enough to stop the spread, and what would help these communities, right? That may mean that certain setups around who is an essential worker and what protections they have, or housing needs to not spread when you come home, but to be able to isolate even if you are in a 5-person family with 1 bedroom, which is quite common in the Bay Area, particularly in lower income families. So really centering what it is these communities have experienced and what they need to not just sit back and watch in a spectator kind of fashion as these numbers continue to rise. The last piece I'll say with a solidarity approach is that instead of prioritizing officials as having the ability to tell truth, which in the US we have certainly called into question quite a lot over these last 4 years, instead of that, a solidarity approach prioritizes what Robert White called a public cultural truth, which is still a matter of truth, right? But it's about arguing that the standard for truth is that a claim cannot be true if, and these are White's words, if it somehow denies or destroys another person's lived experience. So if someone comes to you and says, you know what, you were not in the ethics panel today, and you absolutely were, then a standard of public cultural truth would say that is a lie, as opposed to saying, well, if an official said it, then maybe we'll give it some credence. Right now, much of journalism in the US is getting bogged down in amplifying misinformation and then debunking it, which is not serving anything and contributing instead to that process of desensitization. So I'll just end there by saying that with a solidarity approach, we can find paths forward, not by ingeniously learning to solve global problems alone, but instead listening to people with the most experience based on what they've been living for these last several months. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anita. Very interesting. I want to just make a clarification. Jenna has just corrected my statement earlier, namely that you ask questions via the Q&A, not the chat, for any participants who want to ask questions. So my apologies for that. I would like, if you don't mind, if I kind of get things started here. I'm wondering if I think the idea of the solidarity approach is very interesting, and I'm wondering whether you think that there's in journalism ethics, there's always kind of a tension between traditional conceptions of like certain ideals, and of course Stephen has written extensively about this in the context of objectivity. That the traditional ideas of kind of a detachment and neutrality and non-advocacy and those kinds of things. I'm curious to know how you think about reconciling a solidarity approach, which seems to be somewhat more advocacy oriented, and where that kind of butts up against some of the traditional conceptions of journalistic ideals.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I actually was just teaching yesterday about this question of advocacy and journalism. Are they overlapping spheres? Are they tangential? Or are they one and the same? I should note here that my PhD advisor was Ted Glasser, so the next thing I'm going to say should probably be cited to him, that all journalism ultimately advocates for something, right? It might advocate simply that you need to be informed of what the status quo is. It might advocate for a return to more golden times. It might advocate for radical change in the direction of greater equality and equity in a society. So that's my starting point for my normative conception of journalism. In my own research, I focus very much on cases where journalists themselves have said objectivity does not apply, and it would be egregious to suggest that it should. So one example of that is coverage of homelessness, where the journalists who I've spoken to and interviewed in depth have all noted that objectivity, in many cases when they're covering local issues, they do keep that in mind, but not in the case of homelessness. And we see that with ongoing issues, often those that have very large magnitude, where there is some kind of consensus that the status quo is not really defensible. Now, in the case of coronavirus, what was really fascinating to me at the start in April, at least the start in many parts of the world, were a number of pieces, both editorial and features, as well as the hybrid model of getting away from breaking news, but slightly more long term, that called for flattening the curve. And these, in an op-ed context, you can see that there'd be opinions about that, certainly, but in the feature setting, it was fascinating to me, the coverage that we started to see in national news outlets urging and arguing that this is a fact, that we can indeed work together, all of us, to flatten the curve. And that worked in the US in large measure. And is a great example of civic solidarity. So this draws on Bayart's and Latinen and Pesce's conception of civic solidarity that says we need to stand in solidarity with each other, because what I do today may well affect my neighbor, and so I have an obligation accordingly. And those kinds of obligations, particularly in natural disasters, in wartime reporting, many US journalists, I should specify that too as my scope, they are willing, and actually in some cases they view it as an onus, a moral onus on themselves, to set aside neutrality, to set aside concerns about appearing unbiased, to instead say we will be biased in the public interest.
Yes, I was thinking as you were addressing that issue about the idea of the sort of the sadly the political conflict that's going on in the U.S. And as kind of a half American myself, I am saddened and sympathize, but presumably expressing a positive attitude towards the preservation of democracy, notwithstanding Churchill's reservations about democracy, would be another example of kind of an advocacy that's presumably been built into journalism for a long time. I'm also wondering, I think we have, I'm pretty sure that we have some journalism students in attendance today. And so I'm also wonder if I could ask you about I think the conception of truth that you outlined there is very interesting. Of course, in journalism ethics, truth is expressed in, or the ideal of truth is expressed in different ways, either like a high regard for the truth or a respect for the truth, seeking the truth. And I'm wondering how you, in this context, how you discuss truth with students that acknowledges how philosophically complicated the notion is, and like depending on whether you're a pragmatist, as I believe Stephen is, or whether like you're a kind of an idealist or a rationalist, truth may even be actually unachievable in most cases. And so I'm just wondering how you kind of navigate that with your students, the conception of truth in the context of the solidarity approach that you're describing.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think it's truly important to call attention to the ways in which this gets into complicated terrain, right? But my answer for journalism students and for my own students is that, and this draws on both critical race studies and feminist studies, and a conception of right standpoint epistemology, of grounded conceptions, that the person who has lived this has insight into what the this is that cannot be achieved or second-handedly offered by someone who's standing outside the house. So one example of this was in a Reuters report that won several awards before this was getting a lot of attention, which is the genocide of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. And there was a longer series about, first of all, this genocide happening and denials that it was happening. And second of all, the fact that people who are Rohingya Muslim were escaping on boats, and then they would be captured and put into both camps and human labor camps in neighboring countries, including Thailand. And initially, it was all denial, right? The officials all said, first of all, there's no genocide happening. Second of all, no one is getting on a boat. And third of all, when they get on a boat, they're just fine when they get to these other places. So none of the above. These two Reuters reporters, they understood that that was the claim. They also believed that there was more going on. And rather than reporting those denials as truth, instead they went into a place that they had heard rumors had one of these camps. There was nothing to be seen on maps. They got on their bikes. They rode their bikes through this jungle and came across a camp. And they took pictures of it. They interviewed people there. They came back to those same government officials and said, how do you account for this? And those government officials looked at these camps and said, these do not exist. That is the opposite of truth. I can't pantomime the emoji any better, but it's astonishing to me how simple it is, right? To say that journalism needs to speak truth to power, and certainly I'm a big fan of that. But whose truth are journalists willing to stand with and for? I think it needs to be with the truth of what is happening in people's lives that they have an embodied experience of, rather than deference to structural arrangements that may make it possible or plausible to have a preferred version of truth that insulates certain political aims.
Thank you very much. It's positively Orwellian, the situation that you're describing. I'm going to I have one question here in the Q&A, so I think I'll ask this question and then we'll wrap up this one and sadly bid you adieu. This is a question from Dawson Clark, and he says, thank you for the comments. Can you expand on how we can better center the experience and analytical perspectives of those adversely affected by the status quo? Are there techniques or structures that you find more effective than others? And thanks for that, Dawson.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So, the technique is what I call radical inclusion. And my students at Berkeley are always very quick to ask me, why is that radical? It's only radical compared to what we often get in status quo coverage. So, that's a relative term. But radical inclusion means that fundamentally the main cornerstones of reporting stay the same. So, still sourcing, still interviewing, and still framing. Those fundamentals have not changed with a solidarity approach. But with radical inclusion, starting with sourcing, instead of beginning with officials, we would begin with the people most affected. So let's say we're interested in looking at the impact of COVID on Black and Brown communities living under the poverty line. There's plenty of numbers that we can use to locate where those communities are, and then start with what their experiences have been. Certainly not to expel officials from the narrative or to cherry pick which official we like today, but then to go to those officials with what we've learned from the folks directly affected or directly subjected by current conditions, to ask them questions that are shaped by that insight, right? And then as a second step, in terms of those interviews, oftentimes marginalized people are asked by journalists, how do you feel about that? How did that make you feel? When your child was shot, when your husband died, unable to breathe on the way to the hospital, how did you feel? Without being asked, what do you think and what would help going ahead? Right? That question is very, very rare. And again, it's not a radical question. People ask me as an academic when I'm interviewed, they rarely ask me how I feel about anything. They ask what I think about it. And it's that same very simple question of what do you think and what do you wish could happen next, that the journalists are regularly willing to amplify the views of credentialed, if you want to assume a PhD is a credential, which we can have a different panel about, but assume that credentials mean that your thoughts are somehow now valid to be included. With the radical inclusion approach, we would still include the emotional turmoil, of course, because that's part of what makes us newsworthy, but also looking at what are your perspectives, what is the analysis of what needs to happen. In many cases, it's quite simple. We need gloves and masks and face shields, and we don't have access to them, as one example. And then the final step is with framing, and this came up quite a lot with, unfortunately, with George Floyd's death, with Breonna Taylor's death. The question of, is this a story of an individual named George Floyd and an individual named Breonna Taylor, or is this a story of a system that is working to both oppress and murder Black people across the United States? That second story is very difficult to tell if you've only spoken to people involved in the particular case and asked the questions of them. But once we've expanded out to communities most directly affected, most adversely affected in many cases, the larger picture comes into view if there is a larger picture. Now, in cases where there's not a larger picture, there are still isolated incidents in the world, journalists would also be able to assess that as well. So the three prongs are very much the same as what we already teach and already do in journalism, but it's the devil in the details of how inclusive what happens within those ends up being with a radical inclusion approach.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for that question, Dawson. Very good question. And it's now 12 minutes after 3, and I know that you have to get to a class. So we do thank you very much for joining us. This has been very, very interesting. And stay safe, and thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you all. Be well.
Okay, so now we'll return to somewhat more conventional approach here. So we're going to hear from Stephen next, and then we'll hear from Pat, and then at the end of that, we'll open up the floor, virtual as it is, to questions from anybody. And again, that those questions can come in the Q&A. Okay, so I will turn things over to you, Stephen. Thank you.
Well, hello again, everyone, and thank you, Anita. That was a really terrific speech. I may be more ponderous because I have slides and text, but hopefully not too much. And she raises incredible issues that are very complicated. She said, we will be biased in the public interest, which defines a lot of what I've been writing about lately. So yeah, an excellent beginning. Let me just begin right where I intended to begin. First of all, journalism ethics is the study and application of norms for the responsible use of the freedom to publish. It has been going through a difficult time for some time, and it didn't start with the pandemic. It began at the end of the 20th century with a media revolution placing publishing tools in the hands of the many. It was called then the democratization of media, and now it's just called the crisis of fake news. Responsible reporting now seems to get lost amid the cacophony of angry voices. Today, today journalism ethics makes a difficult transition from a pre-digital, non-global ethics for professionals to a digital global ethics for anyone. Basic principles have been challenged or ignored. Technology has created ethical issues we've never envisaged and were not envisaged by the code writers at the beginning of the last century. Journalism ethics today is a fragmented archipelago of islands where people differ on what media should be. There are today 3 issues that were not evident at the turn of the century, and one is the need for an ethic for reporting global issues, such as war, immigration, and yes, pandemic. Little is said in codes about such global responsibilities. The second issue is how to respond to extreme groups and rigid partisans, happy to see plural liberal democracy fail if only their ideology will prevail. So how should journalists report on hate speech, on demagogues? How much do we understand the causes of unreasonable publics in terms of history and evolution, psychology, and what media triggers encourage people to adopt what I call the enemy stance? And the third issue is how governments and other groups undermine public opinion with deep fake videos and many other new means in a global war of misinformation. This cauldron of macro problems means we need a society-wide macro resistance or response to detox the public sphere and defend democracy. We need a rethink of ethics on 3 levels: a reform of its moral ideology, what its aims and stances, a reform of ethical content, its norms and new practices, and a reform of the ethical structures that hold media users accountable. So there are many things to talk about. I will focus on only one thing, which is structural change, and one idea only, something I call public participatory ethics. Since the origin of modern journalism ethics in the early 20th century, media ethics has been a creature of professionals. Professional journalism was the mediator between the world and the public, and ethics belonged, in a sense, to the professionals. I know, I lived in the system. They determined what norms to accept and how they were updated and enforced. Ethics was a professional directed form of self-regulation. Today, even if this model worked perfectly, it would not address the many problems in our digital universe. Media content is, of course, produced outside professional newsrooms, and how we would restrain intolerant voices online is a very tough question. Also, we face global information issues that professional journalists cannot by themselves solve, such as robotic disinformation programs during elections. So I suppose that, and I propose that we perhaps just change the model a bit. We think of media ethics not as a code, enforced by professionals, although that is part of it, but as collective ethical activity to maintain a healthy public sphere. Ethics has always been a doing, practical and social, anticipating norms that make cooperation among people with different interests possible. So what I mean by public participatory ethics is also an activity based on three notions. First, ethics is both a right and a responsibility. It is, for me, a responsibility of all citizens, not just the mainstream media and not just government regulators. It is also a right of citizens to have a meaningful say in the performance of their media system. Media ethics should be collective advocacy for a media system that is reliable, inclusive, widely owned, fulfills important information functions, and promotes deliberative democracy. And that's where I touch up with Anita. In 2020, to do media ethics is to advocate for the maintenance of trustful channels of information. Media ethics is an ethic of digital democracy. Second, media ethics should be collaborative. We need new organizations and structures that allow groups to work together for democratic community. So we need to connect across many boundaries, including academia, schools and media, information professionals like librarians, media councils, media foundations, NGOs with an interest in good media, such as advocates for human rights. We can readily think about specific changes that would improve news media, such as improving the fact checking by individual reporters. And such improvements are very laudable, but I don't see them as sufficient in this crisis. We need to act together creatively. Third, media ethics is open and participatory, in my view, where it should be. It includes an informed and structured participation by the public that rises and raises media ethics above the level of ad hoc complaints from outside the media system and social media attacks on people inside the system. By involving publics and institutions, ethics would not be so dependent on the frankly varying commitment of media owners and social media behemoths. So how might this work? Here are just a few ideas quickly. I think we can think about these new structures, some of them anyway, as virtual hubs where coalitions work. These structures could be anchored in agencies with already a knowledge of media, schools of journalism, centers for ethics, leading news organizations. And, for the sake of just argument and your imagination, let's pretend we create something called the Canadian Coalition for Media Excellence, an umbrella for coordinating the ethical activity I'm talking about. What would this center do? Or perhaps I should say, what would these centers do? The slide identifies three areas of activity: evaluate media, educate about media, and create and improve guidelines for practice. Evaluation means review and critique of public media. It means exposing unreliable sources and fake news. And in this way, I envisage a sort of sixth estate, if you know your history, which monitors public uses of media and raises awareness about media concentration and other issues. One project would be to create a national online center for monitoring news content and providers. Its public face would be a high-profile site or sites well known to the public as a trusted place to check media sources and debate media practice. Among the coalition's functions would be not just fact-checking, but opinion checking, the discussion of major interpretations of what's happening. It could maintain a registry of reliable and unreliable sources. It could create a national annual State of Media report. There's no end to what can be done. And this multidisciplinary network would be anchored in a coalition of, say, and this is just an idea, several journalism schools at once, a center for democracy, and aided by a fact-checking organization. The aim of education is to create, this activity of education is to create students and citizens who are informed, critical evaluators of media. In this view, coalitions would lobby the education system and government to develop teaching in schools starting at an early age. Topics would include how people use their media devices, cyberbullying, troll intimidation, the exchange of pornography, and yes, the creation of news and fake news. It should be a central part of education in Canada, in a world where media defines reality. And the coalitions could develop teaching modules to be used not only in the classroom, but in workshops organized by civic groups. Also in Europe, as in Europe, working journalists could go into schools to help with the discussions. Create and improve refers to collaboration of professional media ethics media workers, ethicists, citizens, to create guidelines for new problems, new issues, such as new technology like virtual reality, and for coverage of emerging social issues. For example, how should practice be improved to report on hate speech? People gathered virtually in town hall meetings, social media, and citizen assemblies could engage these issues confronting their media system. And these coalitions would not replace existing structures like public editors and news councils. Hopefully these structures would be part of the collaboration. Now, developing this system would be audacious and difficult. But the good news is that many of the elements are in place. To those who worry about the resources, and who doesn't, I point to the slide to remind us of what resources exist. In North America alone, there are codes of ethics, guides on how to evaluate the performance of media systems. There are hundreds of media schools with teachers, scholars, and students, dozens of centers for media democracy, and lots of fact-checking organizations, plus NGOs fighting online misinformation. And then there are links beyond to Europe and beyond. Already, collaborative creative work is underway. Here's one example. The Canadian Journalism Forum on Violence and Trauma recently acted as one of these hubs for journalists, news outlets, psychologists, and mental health groups to come together, and the result was a revised handbook on how to report on mental illness, especially suicide. Meanwhile, at various schools of media in Canada, educators are leading projects for innovative forms of journalism. We can also learn from Europe, as I've discovered, where there are many coalitions of NGOs and groups who are already online using techniques to combat religious hatred and racism. Also, there's room for further collaboration between academia and journalists. To take one example, Harvard, for example, produces the Journalist Review, a weekly digest of the best research, the must-reads for journalists covering the latest complex issue. And it has launched its Misinformation Review. And 2 days ago, the Shorenstein Center at Harvard released this media manipulation handbook with theory, cases, methods, all about how manipulation happens. Once again, an example of research relevant to our crisis. Almost everywhere I turn, I see a possible collaboration. Maybe I'm delusional, but I do. Not long ago, I gave a talk at the Center for Research in Reasoning, Argumentation, and Rhetoric at the University of Windsor. I suggested that they could use their expertise practically to help citizens distinguish good reasoning from rhetoric that manipulates your mind. There's never been a better time for them to get into the game. Meanwhile, I don't deny, and I certainly affirm, that technology is not all bad. It can perhaps help us and support our macro resistance. On this slide, you see an example of what a media startup group in New York called Pressland.com is attempting to do. I don't understand the technology, but basically the aim is to use big data, computer technology, to track the history and reliability of almost every major news story in the country every day. So that's what you would see, for an example of what a citizen would see when tracking down a story. So I don't see the problem of responding to our crisis as a no resources issue, because that just shuts down discussion. I think of it as how resources are to be employed, which I think opens up ideas and discussion. Now, are there practical problems about funding and organizing my ideal Platonic public participatory system? Take it from someone who has created a Center for Journalism Ethics from scratch. Oh yes, indeed. But the same can be said of any new idea, and we'll never know what is possible until we try. So there's no one solution for our crisis, in my view, no one technological fix. And there are cultural issues that I haven't even mentioned. We have an enormous moral choice before us between carrying out our public discourse in reasonable, tolerant ways, or to join the unreasonable in-your-face gang. And we can ask, have we built a society where people prefer to shout and believe what they want to believe? Is the idea of deliberation among publics now an illusion? If so, then no amount of bleating about media ethics will make a difference. However this may be, I still think our best response is a convergence of creative ideas and humane people. So my idea today is just to give you this sketch of an idea of how we in Canada and beyond can come together at a broader level, higher level of organization for these great issues. I can't solve these issues, but I can start. I think that this new and greater civic structure would help us to react to and to go forward with what I call macro resistance. The era of simply complaining about the big bad media is over. The day when medical media ethics was a spectator sport of critiquing the mainstream players on the field, that's past. Today, there is no the media, and we are all players. And as democratic, digital citizens, I don't think we're powerless if we act in common cause. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. A very ambitious plan indeed, but that's very interesting. Lots to think about there. Thank you very much. So let's see, and I'll just remind attendees, feel free to type any questions into the Q&A. We will get to that afterwards, but first I am going to pass things over to Pat Perkle. So Pat, welcome and thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. And thanks for that, Stephen. It's really a big global picture. I'm going to bring things a little bit more down to the sort of more where the rubber hits the road kind of level right now. Just in case, really quickly, in case you don't know what the News Media Council is, it's in the old vernacular, it's a press council. It's a voluntary self-regulatory organization that's meant to serve as a forum for complaints against published news and opinion, and also to promote ethical journalistic standards. So we kind of, I like to say that we serve the industry in terms of promoting ethical, good standard journalism, and we serve the public in being an organization that they can come to deal with complaints about accuracy, framing, context, opportunity to respond, things like that. But interesting, like when you speak, Stephen, we also have a mandate to a certain level to promote awareness of news and awareness of the news media about standards. And to that effect, we've been trying to work more with academic institutions and have J schools and universities as members. So as a collaborative venture, just not the full scope of what you're talking about, but toward that way. Journalists turn to experts, as Anita said, maybe too often they turn to the experts alone. But we would like to make that expertise more available to the news media and therefore to the public. So that's something that's an interesting crossover there. At any rate, maybe just to talk a little bit more about COVID, what from the vantage point of having ethics, our journalistic standards is not just the standards, it's to have the ethics too. So it's not just to do the right thing, but to do the right thing from a human face, kind of like much as Anita was speaking about, to be more than just the detached person that recites numbers or talks to the authorities, but to, Stephen, you talked about, the engaged objectivity to understand that there are people involved here, and the status quo is what it is, but it's not necessarily the only thing. Maybe we need to take a step back and make sure we're including those other voices to be fair and to be ethical. So some of the ways that that's come about with COVID is just in the basic work of doing journalism. How do we do it differently? Well, we don't go to scrums anymore. We don't casually just meet somebody in the hall of a city hall or to meet people. That's much, communication is more controlled, and that can be difficult in terms of not having the same opportunity to dig in there and get answers that you want. So there's more pressure just to take the authority line. You don't have the chance to see people. But people are innovative, they do things. They're still like CPAC or whatever. And so we had a complaint. So people tweet from CPAC. We had a complaint that somebody tweeted that the tweet was wrong. And that's more of a case, it wasn't wrong, but the public has to come along as well and be able to follow that kind of journalism to know that it is a tweet. It's not the whole story, just like a headline isn't the whole story. So the restricted access that journalists have to authorities is a problem. The lockdown has imposed disruption. Another way we have to look at it is, again, similar to what Anita was talking about, is empathy. She talked about solidarity. She talked about just the authority voice. We talk about having the diversity. We've seen a lot in the Canadian media in the last, go back more than 7 months, but I think since the pipeline trends, I think the pipeline coverage at the end of last year really brought out things like viewpoint, protesters, one person's protester is another person's land defender. That was, to us, a really striking thing. Then that opened the whole debate about who are you taking as your authority, and when you're talking to First Nations, when you're talking to communities that you don't know about, and how do you deal with, how do you find out the right people? Is there a right person? Maybe the problem is there's more complex. You don't have to solve the problem as a journalist. You just have to explain it properly so that people can come to their own understanding. A big issue that COVID has brought, it's same issues, I guess, but it's been brought to life in a different way. Privacy and information. Again, that gets in terms of health information. So that gets into the area we've heard about already this afternoon about the public good compared to the personal right. And that's been a challenging one for privacy, I think, and for reporting under COVID. We've had complaints, early days of the pandemic. We get a complaint that a public figure was named, and somebody would object to that. That's their health privacy, that's their health information, and it shouldn't be told that they have that they've tested positive for COVID. Is that strictly true? That's where the ethics comes in, and the judgment, the news judgment, the journalistic discretion. If it's a public figure, yeah, you probably do want to know, and you probably have a right to know if they've tested positive. If it's a staff person at your grocery store or your convenience store, it isn't the same assessment that you make. And I think these are important things for journalists to keep in mind. It's tempting to report the numbers. The information is all there. Is it information you should use in every case? Again, you have to think about the impact. What does that do to the community? Is it making an individual suffer inordinately when really your story for the public good can be told without putting that person under more scrutiny or possible stigmatization? COVID has also brought about a big awareness on scientific and numeric literacy that journalists need to have, because we've been, Anita was speaking about the number fatigue, especially numbers we can't understand. Maybe not all of us can understand. What does it mean to test the positivity? What do all these things mean? Can they be put in a context so that people feel that they're getting reliable numbers, trustworthy numbers, so that people can govern themselves accordingly, so people can trust or not trust the interventions that the government is putting on our lives? Again, a complaint we had was that a graphic explaining the case numbers was wrong. And when we looked at it, it wasn't wrong. It was a logarithmic graph. So it was a matter of understanding that relation, and should a different graph have been used in telling the story? Should there have been an explainer about that? How do we tell the story without introducing that element that's going to make somebody mistrust, again, what you're trying to present as reliable source of information? There's the questions about privacy I think I come back to that because we have our sense of our privacy. Is it culturally different for different groups? Is privacy regarded differently if you're living, for example, in a intergenerational family where I guess we've thought about this a lot about schools reopening. If it's safe to send kids back to school, and then what about kids that come back to houses where maybe their grandparents or even great grandparents live with them? How do you tell that story without othering people, or while keeping them still to be respected as part of your community? Anita talked about disadvantaged areas and not knowing the people's stories from that. Some places where there have been COVID hotspots have been labeled as it's the young people. We had stories about people gathering and being called COVIDiots and being stigmatized, either because they can gather freely because they're of a wealth and a background that they're safe, or because stigmatized because they don't have that option. And one area was, I remember it went from being stigmatized, or the blame was being given to the young people. Then it was, no, it wasn't the young people. It was that they were service industry jobs, but no, it wasn't that. It was because it was an area with a lot of Airbnb and travelers coming in. So, you know, just the care that's needed about reporting that everything seems to be a moving target with COVID, and that's just another moving target we have to be careful about. Opinion writing, headlines, people not, you know, these are always questions and things that attract a lot of complaints. And it's just increased focus on it now with COVID, for example, a headline that says pub closed with COVID case. We got to complain about that because another pub owner thought it was detrimental to his business, or that people would think it was his business. So, you know, even a headline has to be carefully written so that people don't feel disadvantaged by information that the public needs to know, that there is a public interest in knowing the information. So, so those are some of the things. In summary, I think COVID has raised new ethical questions. For example, you know, I think we all know the case about all the registry of people who tested positive was compiled, and then we found out the police were using that registry just to troll through. What would you do about using a story that came out of that illegal use of that information? Would that be something you should leave the story alone? There's still questions on, of course, unpublishing material that people find uncomfortable or disadvantageous for whatever reason. Source remorse is the biggest reason that people request to have stories taken down. It was never a very good reason before. It's no better reason now with COVID, but there have to be considerations, and people have to know how they can ask about that and what your policies are as a publication. But I think that yeah, COVID raises new questions, but I think the day-to-day job of doing journalism depends on the same standards. And I think those standards haven't really changed. And I don't think the ethics of trying to live with the spirit of what is done rather than the letter of how you can do it. And the ethics of trying to be a human being who is looking at the public good, not the status quo, but the public good, I think remains.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Pat. There's lots of really interesting things to consider there. I actually, one question, and again, I'll just flag to everybody again, please feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A. Sorry, not the chat. But I have a question about that I think relates to both both presentations, and that is, I guess, kind of the elephant in the room here, which is the social media platforms. They play an outsized role. Increasingly, I guess we have evidence that people are increasingly their news diet comes from things that they encounter in their news feeds on, Facebook and Twitter and other kinds of things. And so maybe I'll start with you, Pat, in particular. I'm wondering if you have whether you think about the way in which the social media algorithms, kind of the way they function, and I guess is it fair to say it's reasonably well established that they are really designed to kind of reinforce existing ideas and beliefs and so forth, the so-called filter bubble? I'm just wondering, is there a danger that that this impacts the way in which people think about the news media and what their role really is? Is there a risk that sense among people in the communities is becoming distorted? Is there are there kind of correctional measures? Is that something that we should be worried about?
We haven't done research. We haven't done research to look in this, but so I would just say that given our sense and what we read and discuss about this, that I think there's no doubt that your social media gives you what your social media thinks you believe. So there's a shutting down of the conversation, and I think Stephen, you mentioned that I wonder if people are interested. I actually wonder if it's just a thought going back to the earlier decades when there wasn't a distinction between news and opinion, and we drifted very, very badly then into yellow journalism. And I wonder if we got away from that, and I wonder if the impact of social media is pushing hard toward a kind of society where people don't want to know what they don't believe. And they do, I agree, there is a concern that the media is fighting a tough battle against people whose minds are made up and cannot be convinced differently. What to do about that is a pretty huge question. But I wonder some of the things, Stephen, that you've talked about, and some of our work with trying to work with academic institutions, I always think that more information helps, but rather than less. How to get that to people who have who just want to read a headline and know the whole story by reading a headline is a bit of a challenge.
Stephen, I don't know whether you want to, if you have anything you want to weigh in on that particular one. I'm also curious on that, if you have a view on that particular question, but then also the role of social media in this, kind of new collaborative system that you're envisioning,
Right.
and like how that is managed. It seems that like the objectives, and I don't want to pick on Facebook and Twitter and others, YouTube and so forth per se. I mean, they kind of are what they are, and they're not going out and proclaiming that they're providing important information to people the way journalists are. Nevertheless, they do have an impact, and how do you think about how to deal with that challenge in creating the kind of system that you're describing?
Yeah, sure. And thanks, Pat, for bringing the issues down to earth. My view on this is that what I call toxic social media, according to my definition, things that are unreliable, false, blatantly partisan, extreme, it's not going to go away. At least unless you put in place a regulatory system which democracies would feel very uncomfortable with, which means just shutting down contrary voices.
That's the problem.
Yeah. And my view is that one of the reason I've stressed structural reform, and that's a big word that academics like to use. What I mean is just let's do things differently. And one of the ways that I can see that, is why I stressed education, that we get, the more we know about our media, how it works from an early age, the more we can get into and defend ourselves against the worst abuses of social media. It won't be perfect. And so I think, certainly education and all that is very important. The other part of critiquing media, where we have sources, websites and places where people to go, where they can identify what those organizers think are reliable and unreliable sources. I know there'll be an issue. How do you define those things? But that's what we absolutely need. We need to know the provenance, as it were. Remember, in art history, you know the provenance. You need to, or the food chain, you need to know where this story came back. And given the technology, given working together, that would help. I think that we also, I really believe that we don't know as journalists and as public exactly how social media works, how the disinformation happens. So the more we as journalists can know, as the study out of Harvard just shows, how is this operating? The more we can fight it. There are, again, on the downside, certain, as you pointed out, sort of what I would call cultural problems that I'm not sure we can change. If people simply don't have the attention span to want to read a decent long article, if they would rather be enamored with the pop and fizz and video of online, that in fact is going to be a very difficult problem. But at the same time, I don't think we should simply throw all of social media into the trash can. There is a lot of great online work being done, inventive and so on. And so, from my view, is the question: how do we distinguish between the two, right? If I want to read about human rights around global world right now, I certainly will read the mainstream media, the things I consider valid. But you know what? There's all kinds of human rights NGOs are doing fantastic journalism in the field. So it's both good and it's bad. And I don't think we should be technological, pessimists or technological optimists. That's just too easy. We're stuck in the middle, and we got to sort of organize our way out of this. I'll stop.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I have a question from Sarah, and this question for both of you. And she writes, what thoughts do you have about fostering that public engagement / participation in the building and evolution of ethical standards? She says, I've worked in newspapers where getting a single local letter in a week was a win. So I don't know whether I'll kind of throw it out. I don't know whether you want to, who wants to take a stab at that one first?
Well, I'll go first, Pat. Is that okay?
Sure.
I mean, I don't think that if you set up the right systems where people feel that they can comment on their media and learn more about it, I think a lot of people would do so. I don't think you'd be hoping for one letter. You might get too much. You might get an avalanche. But I'm also thinking of structured conversations here. I'm not just talking about a social media site where people hammer on about, did you see that story? Let's get a hashtag. Let's go after that media site. That's not what I'm talking. That's what I don't like. When I said structured public participation, I meant that you have a host, a credible host, an academic institution, and maybe other agencies who host the conversation. And people who enter in, for example, through citizen assemblies, and other mechanisms, they have to inform themselves of the issue. They have to know what the principles of journalism are that we're talking about and why they do or do not apply. And then we talk about what would we want from our media in these circumstances. I know that sounds idealistic, but it actually, I think, is something that's really important. I'm not talking about just, which is what we got, is people just commenting off the top of their heads without some sort of information and structure.
Pat, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, just turn it around a little bit from the journalism side is again, we're thinking a lot and working toward getting more diversity of voices, making sure we're not just going to the authorities and saying what they said. What'd you say? We're looking at the people who are affected, and we've heard a lot from people who say, develop better sources, develop sources in the community, learn who, you know, your First Nations community is, who your about your Black neighborhood or your lower income neighborhood. Develop your sources in there, ask for their participation. You will become better known to them as they become better known to you, and you're more likely to get people volunteering stories and participation by that in that way. It's a slow building way of doing things, but I think it would lead to some authentic journalism that may yield participation.
Could I just add on to that?
Absolutely, yeah, please.
What I found, I agree with all of that, Pat. That's been the secret of great journalism for a long time, is that you get beyond the numbers into people's lives. And what Anita was saying is actually both new, but not that new. First of all, compassion fatigue is a well-known phenomenon. And she's sort of talking about a version of that. And it's good she brings it up. The other point I find about that is that there's lots of things called engagement journalism, community engagement journalism. It sounds very much like the solidarity idea, and it's very important. So, for example, we now have young non-mainstream journalists setting up websites. For example, in Hawaii, I just happen to know particular cases in Honolulu, where they'll actually go down and live and spend time with people in horse shacks and all that, and learn exactly how even a byline change or a bylaw change in the city's zoning might help them. I mean, it's down to that concrete level. But you can't know that unless you give up the old notion that we have to be neutral journalists in every case. Neutrality has its place, but it's in my view overruled. But what we're fighting in the United States, and I think in Canada, is just when you want journalists to do something that's democratically and community valid, up goes the red flag of neutrality to stop you from doing it. And I think that you shouldn't. We are always, and she's absolutely right, the journalists always have values. We always have goals. Even if it's just to inform people neutrally, that's a goal. And so let's get away from that. And let's talk instead of how do we use the best and rigorous methods to do stories that help our community. And so values and emotions, we shouldn't be scared of that. I was a war reporter. And there's no way in the world what I saw, I could not be emotionally affected. And I wasn't, the point was not to let it overcome you or bias your reporting, but the emotion made you passionate. You did more. You did even better journalism. So this old dualisms that exists way back in journalism, it's emotion versus cold facts. Well, that's what I'm fighting because it's still hanging around. For example, when Trump, what is it, a year and a half ago, went and called 4 women of color to go home, the CNN and a whole bunch of people twisted themselves in professional principles, not saying that is a racist statement. They had euphemisms on CNN that you couldn't believe, like it's racist, provoking, perhaps racist discourse. No, it was racist, frankly. And so why not just, the reason they didn't want to do that is because they're thinking about, of course, a reaction from their audiences, but also the doctrine that we have to be neutral. And I'm not throwing out objectivity, I have my own view of it. I'm just saying we have to sort of have a richer journalism ethics to work in today's world.
Yeah. I'm wondering, just in that vein, you both mentioned Anita's distinction there between solidarity and empathy, and I'm just wondering whether does the more solidarity-oriented approach sort of suggest that it should also be more solutions-oriented? I mean, I know that solutions-oriented journalism kind of bubbles up from time to time as a kind of a doctrine that maybe we should aspire to. I'm wondering what you think about that idea.
Pat, you want to go first?
Yeah, I've already said I don't think a journalist always has to solve an issue. I don't think that's always the job. I think we have to give the reader and the public credit for intelligence and empathy on its own. I don't think we should forget, just because we're inundated with ugliness, that there is also good out there. And I also think it's only right to let a community or a group develop its own solutions. It's not up to the journalists sometimes to develop, it's help for them to develop the solutions. Maybe they just need to be heard or whatever. So I like the notion of solidarity. I call it empathy. I don't know if there's a little bit of a distinction or not, but yeah, sometimes there will be solutions that should be pointed out, but sometimes the solutions you just have to describe the situation so people can make their own.
Yeah.
I agree with that. That's
Yeah.
great.
Okay. And also and thanks for that question, Sarah, by the way. She maybe was also kind of getting at the idea that, you know, the old expression that people don't generally know how the sausage is made. They kind of don't, you know, most people, to most people, a newsroom is a bit of a black hole and they have no idea how stories come about and how they're written and how they're edited and how they're, and all that sort of thing. And I'm wondering if her question is also getting at the need for a little bit more transparency about what the process is actually like.
When I started journalism ethics 15 years ago, people were talking about the sausage. And I can tell you, you will have no credibility as a newsroom if you're not transparent today. And at least, I wouldn't say universally, but majorly. And the whole point about the sausage was raised, it was a doctrine or an idea in a time where newsrooms were all powerful and they didn't have to open up their black box. Why should they, such a powerful institution in our society, be unlike every other major association which comes under public pressure to be open? So I think there will be some, and I think this has happened, people have seen what's going on inside newsrooms, and there's been some dismay, but overall in the long run, I think it's good to do all this. But again, it goes back to my view of self-regulation. Some newsrooms or owners might say, no, we don't want to do that. So then you're back to ethics being regulated by the professionals.
Okay. Yeah, thanks again for that question, Sarah. Good question. I have one from an anonymous attendee. What are some of the ethics journalists must uphold in the risk communication of the pandemic? How do they balance public interest and fear mongering in their reportage? Another good question. I don't know, Pat, do you want to have a first crack at that one?
So yeah, fear mongering isn't journalism. Just let's start there. So it's not ethical. Interestingly, the European Alliance of European Press Councils just did a study on their experience reporting in COVID, and it is a violation of standards with some of the press councils in Europe to sensationalize, and sensationalization includes even giving a hint about a false cure. So you have to be quite careful in your reporting to stick strictly to the truth. And I think we wouldn't, I thought that was interesting. There's even something that promised a false hope, false cure is obviously unethical. So yeah, it comes back to, is this a question of sources again, about whether what you're reporting is from a credible source? Is it properly framed? Is it in the right context? You have to be careful. And I think that, again, this is tough territory for journalists because it's numbers and it's science. And I'm not saying no journalists know it. Obviously they do, but we tend to be words and stories people. And when we go into numbers and science, we need to make sure we understand it first. So we're lucky if we can find a source who can translate that for us, who can put it into context. Make sure if there's provisos, don't be afraid to put the provisos in. You're not confusing somebody by explaining the limits of what you're saying. And it takes more time, it takes more space, and those are challenges. But
yeah. I think the ethics here is incredibly complicated. I used to teach how to report on science, and I used to have workshops with scientists. So I know the tensions between journalists and scientists and how they see differently on matters and so on and so forth. I would point to two things that make the writing very important or difficult too. One is that you're reporting under conditions of uncertainty. You have a scientists who themselves are not absolutely sure what this virus is. their story will change. Their story will evolve. You've got to get across to the people that just because the scientists, I wouldn't say made a mistake, but changed their policy on something, it doesn't mean you lose all faith in the scientists. But that's hard to do because people have come to, in our society, believe it's either a fact, it's not a fact, or somebody's waffling, meaning they're not completely certain, then they're not reliable. And so you've got to write the story that says, look, this is the best they know right now, and have, as you said, the provisos, the uncertainties included. You've got to include them in the story. In my view, that's how you inform people properly. And also, I think, I think as a journalist, if you're stuck about conflicting messages, political, scientific, of course, we've seen that happen, but also conflicting messages between so-called scientific experts. How are you going to figure that out? And I think that's a huge problem because journalists aren't, they're not scientists, and the methodology may escape them at times. And I think what you end up doing is balancing what is called the weight of evidence, the weight of scientific evidence, as you do in climate change. And that's the best you can do, where you can tell the people, look, this is what either the majority or the best scientists say. And if there's another view that seems to have some credibility, not just you're going to mention it just for balance, then yes, of course, that should go in the story. But I think this is a double whammy problem for the pandemic. Number one, the first whammy is that your story goes out into a public sphere, surrounded and corrupted and in amongst crap, very bad false science. So your message doesn't get here unchallenged or untainted. It just sort of it can get lost. That's one problem. And the other problem is as I said, is how do you actually report this stuff? How do you tell people that things are going this way, and maybe somebody was wrong on masks or whatever, and not destroy public confidence in the system in general? So those go ahead.
I was going to say, especially when people are so ready to pull out the conspiracy label.
Oh, yes.
The minute you change something, oh, it was a conspiracy about that. And so it's really a tough question, tough to do it well. But the other thing buried in all of that is that people's health and sometimes lives are at risk in terms of conveying this information. So there's a huge ethical pressure to get it right as you can. And so it's a huge responsibility for a journalist to get it as right as they can with all the provisos and not end up having somebody think it's just all a conspiracy and so they're not listening to anything.
It sounds like you're suggesting that journalists practice a good dose of humility, the virtue of humility.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that question. I have another one here from Aisha, and she writes, how do you suggest a journalist talk about their views on what constitutes a public good? How should you talk to your readership about your bias towards the public good? A very interesting question. Thanks very much, Aisha.
That's a great question.
And sorry, just a reminder that we've only got about 10 minutes left, so this may be our last question. But anyway, thanks again, Aisha. That's definitely a very thoughtful, thought-provoking question.
Quickly, every journalism ethics depends on a political point of view. That is what the public good is. I know of no ideologies of journalism don't presume some public good. So how do you talk about it? It depends what your political view is. If you're like me, you're a pluralist, you want liberal democracy and all that good stuff. All you can do is argue to what are the advantages of that for society. In other words, you just make an argument as best you can for that point of view, but open, of course, non-dogmatically open to other stuff. I'm not sure whether she means, or the question is about actually writing stories, or just in general. But
I guess, yeah, she's talking about how you should talk to your readership about your bias towards the public good. I mean, I can sort of imagine that, maybe there's a social media exchange, or maybe you're on a Reddit Ask Me Anything, or, kind of, or even just a face-to-face whenever that returns.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I've spoken about being a human. Journalists are not neutral stenographers or dictaphones. We're people. We have our own experience. We use that experience doesn't limit or define you, but it's certainly a component. And I don't think you should be afraid to talk about if you have an expertise because of somewhere you've lived or somewhere you've studied, a worldview because of travels or lived experience. I don't think you need to be afraid to bring that into a conversation. But of course, your writing has to prove that you can step back from that and present still the facts that you're given, that you're not determined by who you are, where you've lived, but that can inform part of what you do. It can inform how you see other people, how you hear other people, and not to prejudice it, but to inform. And I think you can help people understand the news is written by humans working in newsrooms, working with organizations, that it's not a conspiracy, it's not a big power, big media. I think it's worthwhile.
Sorry, Stephen, I think we've lost your audio, or it's very low. I think we've lost your audio. It's, we can hear you, but it's just very, very, it sounds like it's sort of 90% muted. Maybe the volume just got turned down or something, or the gain. Oh dear. Oh yeah, well that's. I mean, the timing could be a lot worse, since we are kind of we are sort of on the in the final minutes here. But it also, just further to what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like part of the challenge here is to try and convey ideas in a somewhat more tentative way. I mean, I think journalists do have some predilection for wanting to come across as being very factual, presenting things as if, this is the way the world is. And, just referencing some of the work that Stephen has done in objectivity, that, the best case scenario here is that we provide a good, well-established, well-evidenced interpretation of events and facts and so forth, the best that we know them. And I know that can be a challenge, because we have the kind of traditional ethical ideals of balance and neutrality and objectivity and all those sort of things kind of nipping at our heels, while at the same time there's kind of a new emerging media world where we are expected to be a little bit more honest and about our methods, and a little bit forthcoming about, as we were talking about, how the sausage is made, and kind of where we're coming from, without just everybody sounding like it's a big sort of opinionated free-for-all. Yeah. Okay.
By all means, if you're covering a speech or Queen's Park, what they said is what they said. It doesn't matter who you are. If that's what was said in a presentation in a newser, that's it. Where there's limits to. Sometimes there is just a hard factual story, and that's all there is to it.
Right. Yes. Good point. It's a good reminder. Thank you, Stephen. Did that audio come back? Only just very faintly. That's but it's actually, it's like 10 after 4, so we're just in the last minute. So I just wanted to say thank you very much to all the participants here. Thanks for some very interesting and thought-provoking questions. And thank you very much to Stephen and to Pat. This has been a very interesting conversation. I know we're in a very challenging time when it comes to journalism ethics, and we've got a lot to think about. And I thank you very much for your insight on this. Okay. Well, and thanks to everybody. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. So stay safe and be well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.